A new book offers a new post-mortem on the recent federal election and how Donald Trump turned Canadian politics on its head. Plus, to what extent do Canadians enjoy self-defense rights? A case in Ontario has many Canadians asking that question. All of that straight ahead on episode 26 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you with us. A lot to get to. As you are no doubt aware, Canada held an election earlier this year, and it turned out to be a pretty historic election. In fact, we were just tying up one of the loose ends from that election earlier this week with the by-election in the Alberta riding of Battle River Crowfoot. Pierre Poilievre, who used to be the MP for Carleton and Ottawa, of course, he lost that seat and ran in this by-election, so he'll be back in Parliament once that resumes in September. Look, we all knew there was going to be an election in 2025, and yeah, it was a little bit earlier than we expected it to be, but it was so much different than we expected it to be. Think back to a year ago. And it was Pierre Poilievre versus Justin Trudeau. The Conservatives were way ahead in the polls, and it looked like the Liberals were headed to potentially even a catastrophic defeat. Well, Justin Trudeau resigned. Along came Mark Carney, but maybe the bigger factor was along comes Donald Trump. And yeah, we dealt with Trump before, but clearly the second version of Donald Trump was different. And there was a new dynamic to that. The tariffs, yeah, we kind of dealt with that before. The trade drama, the uncertainty, that was there. What was different this time around, though, was the talk about ending Canada. The talk about Canada becoming the 51st state, something Donald Trump talked about a lot. Maybe less so as of late, but right around the time Canadians were getting set to vote, this was a big focus of Donald Trump's. And that clearly changed the dynamic in Canada in terms of what was top of mind for Canadians and what ended up defining that election. There's a fascinating new book out that takes a deep dive into this election and how Donald Trump really turned Canadian politics on its head and gave us, as mentioned, what turned out to be a significant and historic election. The book is out on Tuesday from Sutherland House Books. It is called The 51st State Votes, Canada versus Donald Trump. Joining us now is the author of that book, Justin Ling, is a well-known and highly regarded Canadian journalist. More at justinling.ca. As mentioned, The 51st State Votes out on Tuesday. Justin, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
You know what occurred to me? I mean, it's fascinating in terms of the end of an era, or almost in a way the end of two eras, because you have to go all the way back to 2000 to find a federal election that didn't feature either Stephen Harper or Justin Trudeau. And as we sort of reflect on Justin Trudeau's very abrupt departure from the stage, a big part of this story, it just sort of speaks to how much these two, and him in particular, right, have really shaped our politics in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there was naturally going to be a sea change in this election, right? Yeah. I mean, Pierre Poilievre was campaigning on a pretty kind of radical departure from the consensus status quo, the Laurentian elite sort of consensus that has kind of governed this country for generations, really. You had a feeling like the old way of doing things in this country just weren't working. You had this feeling like it was time to try and kind of radically depart from what we've come to expect. And I think that's what we were gearing up for. And Trump kind of wrecked that in a massive way and ended up making what was already going to be a pretty consequential election even more important and seismic. The phrase most important election in Canadian history gets thrown around a lot, but I think it's pretty apt on basically every level.
What's the thing, if you took a book about the 2021 election or even the 2019 election and you went back a year and you showed it to somebody, you can sort of see how you get there. And okay, that makes sense. We understand where this is all building to. I mean, if you take this and you go back a year and you're telling people that, we're going to have this 51st state election, no one really saw this election shaping up this way, a year ago.
I disagree because at least to some degree, I'm not going to claim prescience or anything, or like I am some magical fortune teller, because people who know me know my capacity for predicting the future is terrible. But I mean, this time last year, I was writing basically we are heading towards an election that at least could be a referendum on who is most aligned with this sort of emerging nationalist, hard right, illiberal movement, and who is best placed to push against it, right? I mean, this is the way that many things have been going around the world for quite some time. You've seen the rise in illiberal populism straight across Europe, mostly on the right, to some degree on the left. Obviously, you've seen that with Donald Trump. You see it with Reform in the UK. You see it with Rassemblement National in France. And for a while now, I've been saying, listen, Pierre Poilievre is dancing this really fine line between kind of establishment Canadian orthodoxy and this flirtation with this brand of illiberal populism that is sort of owing to conspiracy theories, that uses this coded language, this anti-elitist, anti-globalist coded language that promises these sort of grandiose and simple solutions for really complex problems. And for more than a year now, I've been writing, hey, like, this is a real risk for the Conservative Party, and it's a risk for the country, really. And then when we get to the actual election, which is, totally kind of mired in paranoia and worry and concern about Donald Trump, that choice became a lot more stark, and Canadians, as you saw, mostly opted for the alternative.
But it's funny, it wasn't our first Trump election. I mean, I guess Trump 2.0 is different than Trump 1.0. Pierre Poilievre's different than Andrew Scheer. There's the Trudeau-Carney factor. Why was it so different this time?
I mean, Trump 2.0 is so different, right? There was a lot of warnings about what Trump wanted to do in his first term. But, as somebody who covered that both from here and from the US to some degree, we can say pretty authoritatively that both the checks and the balances of the American democratic system and the people in Trump's administration held him back from his worst impulses, right? The people around him, the system around him, the politicians around him were mostly a mitigating factor for what he wanted to do and for the sort of reactionary things he wanted to accomplish. This time around, it is the exact opposite. Congress has been totally cowed. The courts are basically loyal. His apparatchiks in the government want to move harder and faster and do more radical things that I think even the president wants to do. You can look at people like Stephen Miller as a great example of that. All bets are off this time around, right? You can kind of argue that his first term set up where we're at now, and it probably did. But really, we're talking about a regime that is completely unmoored from the constitutional order, that does not care what the courts say, that does not care what international human rights say, what international law says. That is a radical and dangerous thing. And Canadians, I think, are alive to that. I think most Canadians are smart enough to know that this is much different than the first go around. I mean, just look at how he's weaponizing tariffs. Look at how he's threatening our sovereignty. I think people are really aware of that. And which isn't to say, by the way, that people who are concerned about that all voted for Mark Carney. It's not the case. There's lots of people who are adequately and properly freaked out by Trump who still supported Pierre Poilievre. And I think there's good reasons for why they ended up there. And Pierre Poilievre did have some messages there that really resonated with people who are appropriately freaked out about this threat. But really, I mean, let's be real, Donald Trump defined this election in just about every way.
Well, he did. And it wasn't just the tariffs, obviously, and it's not just, his approach to governing. The title of the book speaks to it, this phenomenon where it was a question about our sovereignty, our existence as a country, the 51st state, which, look, interestingly enough, I mean, Trump seemed obsessed about it early this year. I haven't heard him really say it much as of late. What happened with this, first of all?
Oh, he still says it, as do his surrogates when they're reminded about it. Obviously, he has had other priorities recently, screwing up a quote unquote peace deal in Ukraine, deploying the military to American streets. He's a little preoccupied, I think, but there's every reason to think he's going to come back to this in the near future. But, I think some people are probably going to be a little offended by the title of the book. I've already heard from a couple of people who do not love it. But the point of it was to sort of annoy people and kind of shock people, because I'll be honest, I think even though Canadians are appropriately angry and motivated and activated by the threat of Donald Trump, I still think there is this sort of pervasive optimism that goes, things are going to work out in the end. And I understand why we get there, right? Because things, by and large, have worked out pretty well in recent Canadian history. You can even maybe say the entirety of Canadian history. Things have gone well. We have made the right choices, more or less. We have grown more prosperous, more free, richer, and happier over the course of our existence. And I understand why people think that that's going to continue, and why they think also that American democracy will survive and thrive and kind of survive past Donald Trump. But there's really no reason for that level of optimism. I think it was Thomas Jefferson or it was George Washington who said, it's a republic if you can keep it. And there's every indication right now that Americans are not working very hard to keep it, right? The system is falling apart right before our very eyes, and that has real ramifications for us. The only way we can guarantee that we're not going to be the 51st state is if we actually actively defend ourselves against that threat. Maybe there's almost nothing we could do. America is a very strong country. It's right next door. If it wants to annex us, it probably could. But nevertheless, there are things we can, should, and must do if we want to at least give ourselves a fighting chance to resist the liberal strain of anti-democracy that's coming out from the U.S. We want to resist the economic coercion being deployed by Washington. And ultimately, we want to resist the threat of having our sovereignty being consumed by this completely out-of-control madman.
Well, and I think in that there's a criticism of Mark Carney and his approach now post-election versus pre and in the midst of this election, the kind of rhetoric we were hearing, elbows up has gone to elbows back at the side, I guess, right? Like, did you sense that the reality of governing is a little bit different than what we were hearing on the campaign trail?
I mean, yes and no. So if you read the book, I think it's kind of hard not to come away with the conclusion that Canadians made the right choice, right? Both of the major candidates presented two surprisingly similar in some respects, but quite, mostly quite different, visions about what ought to be done. And Mark Carney's, I think, was more serious, more grounded, and more alive to the threat posed by Donald Trump and the U.S., which isn't to say Poilievre's was all bad, but it wasn't quite there. So by and large, I think Canadians made the right choice. But there was always this inherent weakness in Carney's proposal on how to deal with this, which is that it was very high on vibes. It was very optimistic. It conveyed this idea that if we all just kind of come together and kumbaya, we're going to win, that there doesn't have to necessarily be any sacrifice coded into our response. And I think some of this created the expectation from the public that we could have our cake and eat it too, right? The public seems to believe that there is a trade deal to be had with Donald Trump. I don't think there is. The public seems to think that it's possible for us to find new markets for our goods and not have to weather the economic impact of this trade war. We're going to feel it. There seems to be this belief that our counter tariffs are going to hurt them as much as they're hurting us. That's just not true, right? So there's an element of, and I understand why this is happening, right? This is an election campaign. Elections campaigns are really no time to tell the public about the doom and gloom on the horizon. But nevertheless, I think Mark Carney didn't really do himself any favors when he set up this expectation that things are going to be rosy, that we don't really have to give anything up. And now that he's in power, I think he is going to struggle with the fact that he is going to have to go to people and ask for real sacrifices in order for us to win the long-term war, right? We're going to lose some battles along the way. And I don't know that he's quite figured out yet how to convey some of this to the general public. I think that's what we're going to see this fall.
Well, and we see that in politics, right? It's win the election, figure the rest out later. And I mean, there was that element here, I suppose. The extent, though, to which this gave the Liberals a lifeline, or at least allowed for an election dynamic that gave them a chance to win. You talk about Justin Trudeau and his defiance toward the end, that he still believed that he could stay on. He still believed that he could win. Take us back to November of last year. So Donald Trump wins the election. Does Justin Trudeau see this as something that can save him? Could it have saved him?
Yeah, I can tell you categorically that's what they believed. As Canadians were watching shell-shocked, terrified, nervous, kind of disquieted about the results, I can tell you I felt the same. I was in Washington, D.C. that evening and remember it very well, thinking, how the hell did we get here? there were liberals around Justin Trudeau who were, I'm sure, also freaked out and worried and concerned, but we're also seeing the silver lining, which is, oh, thank God, Canadians are going to come flocking back to us because we weathered the storm the first time and we know how to do it the second time. That, I think, there was an arrogance built into that. There was naivete and an ignorance built into that. But it was this pervasive belief because Justin Trudeau always styles himself as a fighter, right? And to be totally honest, I think looking back at 10 years of his government, that's kind of the one thing that he maybe actually was good at. I mean, policy generation, caucus management, even communications in some degrees. He really did flounder on some of the specifics of governing. But one thing he always sort of prided himself on was the ability to go toe to toe with an adversary and come out the other end. I mean, he bested conservatives who really, by all accounts, should have won. He took down, a 10-year prime minister, and he, in his mind, went toe to toe with Donald Trump the first time around and came out with a pretty good trade deal. But the problem with this is that, and I think it was really well encapsulated in the campaign that Pierre Poilievre set up, which is that, you can go and be a master negotiator and you can win the rhetorical fight against the president and you can be the sort of symbolic opposite of him. But it doesn't really matter if Canada is suffering under high inflation and low growth, if we have a productivity crisis, if our services are worsening, if we can't find new markets for our goods, particularly our energy, if our military is weak, if our national security is lacking, right? Like Pierre Poilievre did correctly diagnose what made us weak ahead of the next Trump administration. And Justin Trudeau just had no answers for that. Like fundamentally, his appeal, his attempt to try and stay in power was, I've done it before, I know how to do it again. But it just rang so hollow considering the myriad problems facing the country going into 2025.
Well, Pierre Poilievre was built to run against Justin Trudeau, right? They were ready to fight an election a year ago, as opposed to what we got earlier this year. Still, though, I mean, they emerged with 40% of the vote, a pretty strong showing in that sense, and so there's a lot of still, I think, debate about how well they did or did they blow it. You talk about the whole blow up in the campaign with Corey Tanaik and people in the Poilievre campaign, and Doug Ford's a part of that conversation. You guys are blowing it. And we just had, I guess, kind of a postscript to this election, right? As Pierre Poilievre just had to run in this by-election here in Alberta. So what do you make, I guess, of his role in this? And looking back, how do we assess how they ran this campaign?
I mean, so like I said earlier, like people have been warning the Conservative Party for more than a year. I think really going back to Poilievre's actual leadership race and the vision he sort of presented for the Canadian Conservative Party, I think people have been warning him for quite some time that there was this huge risk in affiliating with this brand of sort of paranoid, I call it paranoid populism, right? It's baked into this idea that maybe the vaccines are dangerous, that the World Economic Forum is some shadowy force that we all have to be terrified of, that the globalists behind the scenes are kind of rigging the system against the common folk. There was always a risk inherent in that it would look so damn similar to the vision that Donald Trump and others are purveying, but also that it robs you from this sort of policy and rhetorical flexibility to actually talk about things as they actually are. And what I mean by that is, when you spend your time, as Pierre Poilievre did, talking to people like Jordan B. Peterson, like Jasmine Lane, this broadcaster who, it freaks out about Klaus Schwab and the dangerous vaccines and this other stuff, and all of these other sort of marginal online influencers who make up this network of paranoid, in some cases, outright conspiracy theorists. When you spend so much time trying to affiliate with them and win their support and trust, and others like them, when you spend so much time kind of appealing and doing a shimmy shake for the Freedom Convoy crowd, it really puts you in a box around a certain set of policy ideas and rhetorical devices and phrases that really alienates you from the general public. And it makes it harder to kind of appeal to both sides. Really, the Conservative Party had a lot of great elements in what they were running on. But fundamentally, they found themselves at odds with themselves. Why did the Conservative Party have an entire plank in their platform that promised to basically decimate, destroy, uninstall Canada's foreign aid system? Pierre Poilievre was promising the exact level of cuts to Canada's foreign aid and international development budget as Donald Trump actually enacted through his Elon Musk-backed cuts to USAID. What a ridiculous thing to promise, right? It does no good for anybody. It makes the world less safe. It saves us an absolute pittance, does almost nothing to reduce the deficit, but it makes him look damn similar to Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the whole gang. That was done to appease a certain base of nationalists who don't want Canada to be involved in the world. But Canadians, by and large, actually support our foreign aid budget. They recognize the benefits of it. So things like that, I think, really affiliated him with this darker, unpleasant kind of international politics that Canadians have basically rejected. It does nothing to speak to people's actual day-to-day concerns. And oftentimes, when they went looking for a conservative message that addressed any of those things, they were lacking. Local candidates weren't allowed to go to all candidates' debates. They often didn't speak to local media. Even elected MPs were muzzled and silenced by the campaign. Popular provincial politicians like Doug Ford and Tim Houston in Nova Scotia were basically cast aside from the campaign. There was a cult of personality based on Pierre Poilievre alone, and the message he was sending, again, turned people off, didn't respond to many of their concerns, and really downplayed, I think, the most effective aspects of the campaign. And it was all done in service of this attempt to win over this sort of paranoid, anxious, conspiratorial subset of the population that ultimately wasn't enough to push them over the edge.
There's a dilemma there, isn't there? And not just in this campaign. I think moving forward, Poilievre faces a leadership review in January. The Conservatives need to figure out where they want to go, because that 5 or 10% that Pierre Poilievre couldn't quite get, if another Conservative leader is able to get that, don't they lose at the other end that 5 or 10% that sort of speaks to, that voting base that you're talking about?
What I absolutely because you're right. You're 100% right. But what I despise about everything you just said is that it treats the Canadian public as though they are branded and affiliated with a specific ideology or party, and that they are immovable. That left-wing voters or union members or big city liberals are completely so alienated from the Conservative Party that they would never consider crossing over, and vice versa. But that's just not how things work. We know that's not how things work. We know that there was a ton of Democrats and liberals who had actually switched to Pierre Poilievre because they heard some of his messages around inflation and other things. We know that there were conservatives who switched to Mark Carney because they liked his message on Donald Trump, right? Vote swapping and vote switching happens all the time in Canadian politics. But yeah, when you talk to certain conservatives, they talk about basically 30% of the population who will never leave them. They talk about, 5 to 6% who are naturally conservative, but who maybe stopped voting or went for the People's Party, but who they need to win back. And they consider the rest of the population completely beyond their reach. And that is a loser attitude. It is a defeatist attitude. And I think actually much of Poilievre's success last year, even coming to 2025, suggests that a more broad-based message actually would have won over a lot of people, right? I mean, he actually did make some inroads with union members. He did make some inroads with suburbanites and urbanites who traditionally don't go conservative. But ultimately, when they got to the ballot box and thought real long and hard about what kind of leader they wanted, they did pull back from Pierre Poilievre. And it's not because they're not real conservatives or they were never going to vote conservative or whatever. It's because Pierre Poilievre was actually kind of repulsive to them at the end of the day. He did things and said things and made himself look like something they did not want. And I just find the entire conservative ethos of this, that they kind of have to cobble together this third of the country and keep them together so that they can kind of impose themselves on the other 2/3. I find that really off-putting. And I really long for a day where the Conservative Party goes back to trying to win, 100%, not actually 100%, but at least trying to win 100% of the electorate again. I think they would be more successful. But, the Conservative Party does not ask me for my advice very often.
I suppose not. But it is funny. We just saw recently, so Air Canada flight attendants go on strike. The government orders them back to work. The Conservatives are actually standing up for the workers here, which was an interesting dynamic. But it just speaks to, I guess, in a way, the party we're not really talking about here, and the party you don't really spend much time talking about in the book, the NDP, which in the midst of all of this, kind of surprisingly, I suppose, has kind of become irrelevant.
Well, yeah, and there's a little bit of the, so, the book does not talk about the NDP because you're right. They were largely irrelevant. They made themselves irrelevant. The media didn't do it. The Laurentian elites didn't do it. The NDP made themselves irrelevant. So I didn't feel the need to talk about them very much. But towards the end, I do sort of say, the party needs to decide what it wants to be for. After the debates, after the scrums and everything were canceled, there was all this chaos of the debates. I wound up in this hotel ballroom in Montreal with Jagmeet Singh and a handful of other reporters. And I asked him a question that I've asked him before, and I kind of keep asking it. I said, Mr. Singh, what do you want to build, right? Like, the NDP used to be the party of building stuff, right? Building new railways, building, tons of new housing, building a new system of whatever. I said, what do you want to build? And Jagmeet Singh didn't have an answer. Like, he really didn't. I mean, he kind of said, I want to build new social housing, but even in the NDP platform, they were promising orders of magnitude less than what the Liberal Party was proposing, and orders of magnitude less than what the Conservatives were proposing. And then he said something about a power grid that frankly just was a completely unserious, actual proposal. And so it really struck me that the NDP have totally lost its way. It has no idea what it's around for anymore. It largely exists to say, hands off our healthcare, hands off our EI. But ultimately, voters don't want to hear that they're going to have EI. They want to hear they're going to have a job. And that is, you're right, that is where the Conservatives have absolutely eaten their lunch. And they were doing a very good job, I think, up until kind of the last couple of months. And this is the growth opportunity, I think, for the Conservatives, is how do you convey to, kind of ideologically unaligned people, maybe kind of soft progressive, people who are working class, people who are struggling to get by or who are otherwise, ambitious and optimistic. How do you reach them and convince them that the policies you're proposing are going to unleash growth and opportunity and excitement, and it's going to build new things? The Conservative Party has a huge opportunity there, and Pierre Poilievre, when he's on, is really good here, right? He has successfully talked to union members, especially the Air Canada strike, I think, is a great example. He has reached out to the construction trades to say, I'm going to reduce the taxes, reduce the regulation. I'm going to unleash this ability to build everywhere. People are inspired by that. People who listen to, those sort of business self-help podcasts about the hustle and grind, people who invest in crypto, people who are excited by AI. Those people are not traditional conservatives, but they're excited by some of the messages presented by Pierre Poilievre. And I do genuinely, and I heard people during the campaign talk exactly like this. I do think that if not for Donald Trump, Pierre Poilievre would have totally cannibalized that part of the electorate and would have won this election handily. But Donald Trump really did screw everything up. And I think Poilievre screwed up his own chances by risking that affiliation, that identification with the Republican Party.
And that remains a factor. I mean, it's technically possible, I guess, that our next election might occur just after a new president is inaugurated, but it's entirely possible we might have another Trump election in this country.
Yeah, and if it's not Donald Trump, it could very well be J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka or whatever, right? Like, I keep saying this. There is no reason to be optimistic. There is no reason to believe that things are going to revert back to the mean. There's no reason to think that even if Donald Trump is replaced in the short term, that whoever replaces him is going to undo the damage he's done or even stop it. There's a good chance they're going to accelerate it and increase this turn towards this bellicose, illiberal, anti-democratic, anti-Canadian policy. And I think we have to prepare for that, not hope for the best and sort of continue muddling through until all this is over.
The book is out on Tuesday. It's called The 51st State Votes. Much more from you, justinling.ca and bug-eyed-and-shameless.com. Justin, thanks so much for the conversation here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.
Right. Our thanks once again to journalist Justin Ling. Check out his new book. It's called The 51st State Votes, Canada versus Donald Trump. It's out on Tuesday, published by Sutherland House Books. More at sutherlandhousebooks.com. So a really fascinating deep dive in an election that I think certainly is one for the history books. All right, coming up in just a moment, we're going to talk about a case out of Ontario that's getting a lot of attention this week and probably still for many weeks to come. And it gets to the whole issue of self-defense and what you're expected or allowed or entitled to do if you're at home and somebody breaks into your home. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Okay, so as mentioned, there's a case in Ontario that's getting an increasing amount of national attention, and it's prompting an interesting conversation around the laws that pertain to self-defense. Here's Alberta Premier Danielle Smith commenting on the case when she was asked about it at a press conference in Calgary on Thursday.
Well, if you don't want to get shot or beaten up, don't break into people's houses. It's pretty straightforward. We had a similar incident in Alberta where somebody defended themselves, and they determined that there was not a reasonable likelihood of conviction, because we do expect that people are going to use a reasonable use of force to defend themselves and their families, and I support that.
Earlier in the week, Ontario Premier Doug Ford had a lot to say about this case. In fact, he wasn't even asked about the case, but offered his thoughts nonetheless.
Did everyone hear about the story in Lindsay? So this criminal that's wanted by the police breaks into this guy's house. This guy gives him a beating, and this guy gets charged. And the other guy gets charged. But, something is broken. I know if someone breaks into my house or someone else's, you're going to fight for your life. This guy has a weapon. You're going to use any force you possibly can to protect your family. I'm telling you, I know everyone would. I'd be scared to break into Kevon's house. Look at this. He's like a linebacker. He'd beat the living crap out of the guy, as he should. Because enough's enough here. Violence and breaking into people's homes, putting guns to their heads. And guess what? Some bleeding heart judge, little Johnny, he didn't have a good upbringing. So we're going to let him out on bail 5 more times because he's on his 5th, being let out on bail 5 times, just to go do the same thing the next day. I'll tell you one thing. I get more calls than anyone in the country. People are done with this. They're absolutely done. They're finished. You should be able to protect your family. When someone's going in there to harm your family and your kids, you should use all resources you possibly can to protect your family. And maybe these criminals will think twice about breaking into someone's home.
And a similar sentiment being expressed on social media by federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who wrote this week, quote, "Your home, your family, your life. If someone breaks in, you deserve the right to defend your loved ones and your property, full stop." And I would imagine other politicians are going to stake out a similar ground here, because I think this, by and large, speaks to where the public is at on this issue. The belief that if someone breaks into your home, you confront an intruder in your home, you should have the right not just to defend yourself, but to have leeway in what you feel you need to do to deal with the situation. But what's reasonable? Where are the limits? Now, here's the thing with this case. I think there's still a lot of questions about this case, and I think it's incumbent on authorities, on police, or I guess maybe the Crown, to explain as they understand it what happened here. And more to the point, why the decision has been made to lay a charge against the resident who was the victim of this break-in. So initially, when we first heard about this story, it sounded like there was police called it an altercation, which certainly made it seem like there was like a fight between the intruder and the individual who lived in the home. Now, the intruder ended up going to hospital with life-threatening injuries. So the intruder is facing charges related to the break-in enter, and apparently he's somebody who was wanted by police. But again, the individual who lived in the home is also facing a criminal charge here, and that's why this has sparked such a reaction. Like, this person's the victim, this person was responding to a situation. Why is he facing criminal charges? So like I say, initially it seemed like, okay, maybe this was a fight, and this burglar, the guy who broke into the house or the home, was almost like pummeled to death or near death. Well, the story came out on Thursday that there's more to this case here. And so again, in the way this is being communicated, people are going to follow this case. People have a lot to say on this case. It evokes strong emotions. So I think it's important that people know as much as possible at this point. So here's the story Thursday from the CBC. It says the Lindsay, Ontario man facing criminal charges for allegedly attacking a home intruder is accused of using a knife in the incident, according to court documents. A charge sheet filed by police on Thursday and reviewed by CBC News identifies the apartment tenant as Jeremy McDonald, 44 years of age. The documents say McDonald is charged with aggravated assault and assault with a weapon after he, quote, did endanger the life of Michael Breen. Now, here's an interesting paragraph here. Kawartha police previously declined to identify the two men involved in the incident and have not said whether the pair knew each other. That latter point, I think, is pretty important here. If they didn't know each other, come out and say so. If they do, come out and say so. But to leave it vague like that, it's an important detail. Okay, so here's another important part of this story. Police say they were called to the home at approximately 3:20 a.m. on Monday for a report of an altercation. They said officers learned the resident had awoken to find an armed intruder in his apartment. A fight ensued, police said, and the alleged intruder was seriously injured and airlifted to a Toronto hospital. Police said Breen, who they've identified as the alleged intruder, was already wanted by investigators at the time of the incident. They said he faces multiple charges in connection with the Monday incident, including weapon possession, breaking and entering, and theft. So it obviously wasn't just a fight, even though police have described it that way. They say one guy had a knife, the person who was living in the apartment, and that the intruder was armed. Well, armed with what? Also armed with a knife, armed with a gun, armed with something else? Because that's pretty important to this story. So yes, if you're at home and someone breaks into your home and you confront them, and that thief, that burglar, that criminal is holding a knife or holding a gun, well, it's pretty reasonable that you would defend yourself in a similar way. So again, I think the question here is, why was this guy charged? In what way did he go too far? Is it just the nature of the injuries? I mean, it sounds like he got the upper hand against the thief, which is good, clearly, right? Because he was minding his own business. It's the other guy who committed a serious crime by breaking into his home. And I think this is where it really resonates with Canadians, that thought that, a horrible thought. It's bad enough that if you're away somewhere and you come home and your house has been broken into, just how violated you would feel. But the idea that that would happen when you're at home, or when your spouse is there with you, or your kids are there with you, like, that's a pretty scary situation. You don't know what somebody's capable of. Somebody who's obviously capable of committing a serious crime in the first place by breaking into your home, was so brazen in doing so that they would do that when you're at home. And they probably already know that somebody's home and just don't care. And the other thing is, if you see that person has a weapon, I think you can reasonably deduce from that maybe some possible sinister intent. So I think this is why you're hearing this from the politicians, because they understand where Canadians are at on this. I'll be shocked to see any political leaders really take the opposite stance here. Like, how would you explain that to people? Someone breaks into your home, they have a weapon, you should run and hide, you should call the police, you should try to yell at them to leave. Or you can punch them, but you can only punch them once. Or if they have a knife, then you can have a knife, but you got to be careful when you're using, the idea that you would bind the hands, so to speak, of people by having all these sort of conditions on what you can and can't do, and people doubt what they're allowed to do in a situation, it could be dangerous for them, obviously. And that's the problem, though, is how specific can you make the law? Because even if you give people the benefit of the doubt, the so-called castle doctrine, there are going to be limits. Like, you can think of an extreme case where, you hear these anecdotes of people who are drunk and they come home, but they're at the wrong house and they don't realize it, or the wrong house or the wrong apartment, and somehow they get in and they pass it on the floor. That doesn't give you carte blanche to just, take a baseball bat to the guy's head or to shoot him or stab him. You need to assess the situation, assess the nature of the threat. And so I think you can think of these examples where, maybe a certain kind of response would be unreasonable, but we're not talking about these extreme cases. So I think it's incumbent on police to explain what happened here, or the Crown or somebody, so we can better understand this. Because I think Canadians need to understand what the law says. But at the same time, as much as you can do that, you are still going to have some degree of uncertainty. Because the law can't cover every single conceivable scenario. And even if you make it more clear that homeowners can defend themselves, there's still a line. And I think it is tough to define that line because it is going to depend on a lot of things. There was a helpful post this week in some of the conversation happening on social media. Michael Plaxton, who's a professor of law at the University of Saskatchewan, talking about this case, as so many Canadians are. And he gave kind of an overview of what the law says. And I think it's important that people understand this. Like, don't be afraid of defending yourself. Ultimately, in a situation, the most important thing is that you're safe, your family's safe, and do what you need to do to make sure that remains the case. But yeah, people will say, but this guy got charged. Like, that's not something anybody wants hanging over their head, is that you've been the victim of a crime, now you're worried about your physical safety, and you might end up going to jail. So here's some important points laid out by Professor Plaxton. Number one, he says, if you encounter a stranger in your home, you may use reasonable force or threats of force to expel them from your property, even if they present no plausible threat to you or your family. Now, it's interesting because Danielle Smith made reference to a case in Alberta. I think she's talking about a case near Okotoks where a farmer fired some warning shots after some thieves were on his property breaking into his vehicles. He ended up getting charged because one of those shots ricocheted and hit one of the thieves in the arm, I believe was the case. And so that got a lot of attention. And ultimately, yes, he was charged, but those charges were dropped. I think maybe that's what the Premier was referring to. And it speaks to this here. So you don't have to have a thief or a burglar running at you or pointing a gun at you. If they're there and they're on your property, even if they present no plausible threat, you may use reasonable force to get them off your property. But since in that scenario you're not acting to protect life and limb, reasonable force will be limited. He says, number two, once you threaten or use minor force in defense of property, the confrontation can naturally escalate. If the intruder responds with force or threats of force, you are now entitled to use heightened levels of force, potentially including lethal force. Number three, Canadian law has traditionally been that you are not required to retreat from your home when confronted with a physical threat of force by an intruder. The statutory language has changed, but it's still the case that you are not disadvantaged by the choice to stand your ground. Number four, if you use lethal force against an intruder in defense of yourself or your family, there are a range of factors to be considered when determining whether that was reasonable. Now, if you beat a man to death for reasons that have nothing to do with defense of yourself and others, most sensible people would agree that you should go to jail. Thus, there is a motive requirement to claim defense of property or person. Moreover, there are other considerations built into what makes force reasonable. Right? Are you a 300-pound MMA fighter against a 90-pound waif you can easily restrain without risk to yourself? But the point is, to the extent that bets aren't off, it's because of moral factors that are by and large uncontroversial about this idea that if someone's in your home, all bets are off. But even with that in mind, the courts have recognized that in high-stress situations, we can't expect cool-headed calculation by people in fear for their or others' physical safety. Some degree of overreacting is understandable. So all of that is to say, yes, there's inherently some gray area in the law here, but there is a lot to ensure that people have a legal right to defend themselves. And where possible, to give the benefit of the doubt, because it's a terrifying situation. And so understanding, as Professor Plaxton said, that there will be in that kind of a situation some degree of overreacting, I think we need to understand that. Which I guess brings us back to this case in Ontario. An armed intruder, police say. So not only has someone broken into your home, that person is armed. So the idea that you would respond with comparable force, again, on the surface seems pretty reasonable. But maybe there's a lot we don't know about this case. And so that's the problem in Canada when it comes to any sort of criminal case. In contrast, you see in the U.S. and police and prosecutors are constantly doing press conferences and talking about cases. The tendency in Canada is to be very tight-lipped by police, by prosecutors, and others. And we're seeing that here, right? They're worried about the case and, it's moving forward and we got to be careful about what we say. But I think because there is such a public interest in this case and a public interest in understanding the principles that exist around self-defense and understanding this situation here, because I think in a way we can all put ourselves in the shoes of this person, who I believe was renting the apartment, I know homeowner is kind of the term we use, but anyway, this was his home. And in that sense, we can all relate and empathize with being in that kind of a situation. But if there's some other elements to this case that we're not aware of, that frame it a little bit differently, where people would say, oh, okay, I didn't realize that had happened, that's a little bit different. So we're just going off what's been made public. And the point about the knife that was revealed, that wasn't police at a press conference telling us that. That was reporters accessing court documents. So initially we had what sounded like a fight. Now we got a situation that sounds a lot more serious. An armed intruder, armed with something we don't know, and a homeowner, a resident who was said used a knife in response. So clearly if there was some kind of altercation, which police described it as such, well, this guy prevailed. And yeah, I mean, it would be unfortunate, obviously, somebody died, even somebody in the commission of a crime here. But I think the extent to which Canadians would be sympathetic of a person in that situation, it would be a pretty low level of sympathy. It's kind of like what Alberta's premier said in her comment. If you don't want those kinds of bad outcomes to occur to you, don't do that in the first place. And I think that's the other part of it, too, is the idea that maybe this could be some kind of a deterrent. You know, typically I would think people breaking into homes are trying to find homes that are empty. But the idea of a home invasion or brazen thieves just going in and thinking, well, so what? What are these homeowners going to do? We're going to go in and steal stuff. Well, the idea that they might be afraid of doing so, because we've made it clear that bad things might happen to criminals who do that. So maybe they ought to think twice. And I think that's the other element of this case, not just about, I'm worried about defending myself. Sort of collective interest in sending that message. We don't really know anything about this guy, but he stood up for himself, or at least that's the perception. And if the message is there that other Canadians would do the same, then maybe that has a collective deterrent effect on what's considered a pretty serious crime, breaking and entering, especially when somebody's at home. So you can see why this case is getting attention. I think you can see why we're seeing politicians like Danielle Smith and Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre and presumably others saying what they're saying. I mean, there's some degree of grandstanding in that maybe, but ultimately I don't think they're wrong. And I don't think Canadians are going to think that they're wrong, or that Canadians are going to think those are controversial remarks by any extent. So we'll continue to watch this case closely, see what more we learn about this, and again, hopefully a better explanation of what happened and why police decided to lay charges. Now again, and back to the case that Danielle Smith had alluded to, simply the laying of charges doesn't mean that, this guy's going to jail. It could just be a case of police not sure how to handle this. Let's just put together a case. We'll give it to the Crown. Then maybe the prosecutors will look at it and say, this is ridiculous. We're not going ahead with this, and drop the charges. And for that matter, this could end up going to court and a judge could toss the case or find him not guilty. But along the way, I mean, there's a process. The idea that you would still have to find a lawyer and all the cost and all the stress of going through the process, I think people see that as a form of punishment in and of itself. So, yeah, if this is a weak case and if this is just going to get tossed anyway, the sooner the better. But like I said, we'll see what more comes of this, and I think it's important that we learn the full details as much as we can as to what happened. But yes, we have not heard the last of this. That much is for sure. But anyway, that's where we'll leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Really appreciate you being with us here on the podcast. No show on Tuesday. We will have a new episode of The Line Alberta coming up on Wednesday. You can find that at alberta.readtheline.ca. Also got a piece up there looking back at the by-election, speaking of Pierre Poilievre, that he prevailed in on Monday in the riding of Battle River Crowfoot. So you can read more there as well, alberta.readtheline.ca. We'll have another episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show coming up a week from today, next Friday. Much more, as mentioned, robbreakenridge.ca. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.